Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis Affamie History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
In this episode, Wendy Aris will be joined with Professor Paulette A. Ramsey, who is a full professor in the Faculty of Humanities and Education at the University of the West Indies, Mona, Jamaica. She is an interdisciplinary academic, an established writer and researcher whose interests include language pedagogy, writing theories, and Afro-Hispanic literature and culture. Professor Ramsey's work has brought the history, racial, and cultural dynamics related to various diasporic communities in Latin America and the Hispanic Caribbean to center stage. We will be discussing her book, The West Indian Presence and Heritage in Cuba. So let's have a listen.
Thank you for coming on to the podcast, Dis Affamie History, Professor Ramsey, to talk about your book, The West Indian Presence in Heritage in Cuba. And before we start, can I just have you just do a brief introduction of yourself?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for your invitation. It's my pleasure to join you and to talk about a subject that is very dear to me. The book was written as a result of symposium that we had here at the University of the West Indies. I organized that symposium along with a group of persons from Guantanamo, Cuba, which today perhaps has the largest community of people of West Indian descent in Cuba. But I am professor of Afro-Hispanic literatures and cultures, which means that I do research, a lot of hard research, on Black communities across Latin America and the Spanish Caribbean. And these are communities that have not received much attention because in some cases they say they do not exist. So Mexico, for instance, is one place in which I have done a lot of work on Blacks. And until recently, even the Mexican government was refusing to admit that there were Black people, real Black people on the Pacific coast, even though you don't see them when you go to Mexico City and so on. I've done work on Colombia, Blacks in Colombia. Those Blacks are far more well known than others because the Colombian government has done so much to, bring them out of the shadows and so on. I haven't done any work on Brazil, even though that's the largest Black population in Latin America. I've done Cuba. I've done Costa Rica, which is similar to, in some respects, similar to Cuba. And I have done some work on Jamaicans in Ecuador. You wouldn't believe that there are people of Jamaican descent in Ecuador. There are Jamaicans all over the world. I think Jamaicans, Caribbean people in general, but Jamaicans in particular, have been extremely adventurous, extremely resilient, and there are people of Jamaican descent almost all over the world. In Ghana, the whole community of Jamaicans, in Botswana, all over the place. So I enjoy looking at migration themes and, the way people move and work with great determination to maintain their identities. They don't just go and get lost and swallowed up. So like the British West Indian the community in the UK has got the Windrush people. They have got a lot of, even though I'm also a writer of fiction, and my two novels located in that sort of sphere. They focus on the British West Indian community, particularly because of my connections. My mother was a kind of post Windrush person. So she didn't go in the height of the Windrush period, but she went, towards the end and has lived there for most of my life. So I've been able to meet with these people a lot and to communicate with these people because of my visits back and forth. So basically, that's who I am. I'm a researcher. I'm a writer. I'm a university professor. Currently, I'm the research fellow at the UWI's Institute for Africa Caribbean Advocacy. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful that. And I'm glad that, you're looking at stories or narratives that are not really told much in terms of where people have migrated or moved to. Because when you're researching your family, that's the only time that, well, for myself in particular, that I've been able to find where people have gone and where they migrated and when they migrated and during those times. So it's quite fascinating to know that people have had the ability to go pretty much anywhere and everywhere.
Yes.
It's just whether or not we can be able to uncover those. And I'm glad that you mentioned all of those different countries, because some of them I did be able to find family members just migrating to there. And I'm just thinking, that was great. So it's as I said, it's a very fascinating subject field. So what would you say then were, I guess, in this instance, for the West Indians that migrated to Cuba, what were their motivations, particularly in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries?
Yes. So let me begin by saying the first group of Jamaicans to go to Cuba, and this is not talked about a lot, but it did happen, that Jamaicans actually went to Cuba in 1875, as early as that, because we had connections with people who were involved in the War of Independence. So you had Antonio Maceo, you had Jose Marti, and at the same time, but Simon Bolivar was coming from somewhere else. But we went through a period of Jamaica serving as a kind of refuge for people who got into trouble because of their anti-colonial positions. So Jamaica served as home to Antonio Maceo, for instance, at one point, which is why we have high school here built in his honor. And we celebrate his birthday, albeit on a small scale. So in 1875, there were Jamaicans who went to help to fight in that War of Independence. The big migration wave started in the 1920s because sugar was king in Cuba. Whereas sugar was still being cultivated in the rest of the Caribbean, in the English-speaking Caribbean, Cuba was the country, because slavery had lasted longer there as well too. And so they were supplying the world, all of the Spanish former colonies and Europe and so on. And Cuba was really the place where a lot of wealthy people went. You go to Havana, if you've been to Havana, you see how Havana is a replica in terms of its architecture, old Havana. So Cuba was an amazing place. There's an amazing appetite for sugar, and they needed workers. So in the 1920s, West Indians, Jamaican in the main, because, Jamaica is the largest of the English-speaking countries, went to work on the sugar plantations. Then in the 1930s, there was a kind of second wave when Jamaicans who had worked in Panama on the railway line, and when they finished working on the railway line, so these Jamaicans were not yet ready to go back home, many of them. Many of them went back home to Jamaica, came back home, but some of them said, no, we want some to explore some more. And they heard that Cuba was recruiting. The United Fruit Company, which was a huge company run by the Americans, was expanding its operation throughout Cuba. And so they were recruiting. So many of them went to Cuba from Panama. Some went to Costa Rica in that time. And so the wave continued. The wave expanded a little more in the latter part of the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, when there was this demand for a more sort of educated kind of English-speaking migrant to work on the American base in Guantanamo. So Guantanamo is the only city to which they went. Guantanamo was a city, by our standards. The Haitians had gone to Santiago. So the Haitians tended, so this is why you have a strong Haitian community in Santiago de Cuba. But they went to Guantanamo because there was a demand for them as bookkeepers and, accountants and so on the base. So many of them went there. But they went largely to work in areas like Barnes and Preston, and Camagüey in the eastern part to work on those sugar plantations and around the plantations. In Barnes, for instance, almost everything in the 1940s and 50s. When I did my research in Barnes and I spoke to a gentleman who has done a lot of work on that subject, and he could show me that the hospital was run by Jamaicans. The nurses all went there from Jamaica. The schools were run by Jamaicans, the schools for West Indian migrants. So they were disciplined people. They were hardworking. They spoke English. That was a big plus for them because they spoke English. They had been educated in the British system, and it made it easier for the Americans to work with them because of the English. It was a little harder for the Americans to communicate with the Spanish-speaking people. The Jamaicans went in search of a better life because even though many of them could find jobs in Jamaica, the wages were very low. The salaries in Cuba were a little better. And so they preferred to accept that. And then a big plus also was that many of them had worked. The reason they went to Panama was that they had worked on the railway line with British engineers in Jamaica. So they had this reputation of being strong workers, able to work with iron and soldering and in blasting rocks and so on. And so this is why they went to Panama, because they were known for their endurance. And then when the railway line in Cuba now was being built, they also sent for them. They were the people who were called to go and build the railway. So there were several reasons they went.
And, thank you for that. And because I know you mentioned as well with the United Fruit Company. I mean, I know it's not part of this discussion, but that is a major key figure throughout the Caribbean.
Oh, yes. And
many different times in terms for being able to migrate. So I'm really glad that you were able to mention that.
Yes.
And then, of course, how did, I guess, with the sugar industry in Cuba and, of course, the labor demands that you mentioned before, really influence the West Indian migration to Cuba? Because it's not only just sugar. You mentioned a lot of other industries, but if you could just go into, I guess, greater depth for that.
Good. They were mainly working on the sugar, what they called sugar mills, the centrales. They call them centrales. If you have that book, the photograph on the cover of that book is the photograph of Central in Preston. Any West Indian in Cuba immediately recognizes that photograph. And in front, the reason I loved when we took this photograph is that it has the sugar mill or sugar factory in the background where built by West Indians, by Jamaicans, and the railway line running across. So that picture just tells the story of what they did and their ongoing labor. So they would work in the sugar mills to produce the sugar, harvest the cane, work in the mills to produce it, and then the railway line would take it to wherever the ports were. So there were many, many centrales, mills, factories around Cubab, around the country, and they established themselves mainly in those areas. They were given housing. If you go in Preston, you see some of the old houses. They were given, little houses were built for them to be there. And so it made it a little easier for them to settle, because when they went, they were given, houses to be there. And that's always a big problem when people move. Some of them took their families when they went, young children and wives. Some of them didn't. They went, established themselves, went back for them. Some of them never came back, never looked back on the families they left behind. There's a lot of that there were families some of them went and started new families.
Exactly.
Forgot very conveniently, albeit in the minority, that they had a wife, somewhere, and left there. So there are stories of people who, discovered when they came looking, because there are those stories too, that there are people who went looking for their family members back to Jamaica, and they discovered that they had siblings here. Because their father had a family here already. Yes.
Yeah, it's just part of that whole, migration story. And I know that you mentioned earlier in regards to the English speaking that it really helped with their interactions with the United States. However, what influence would it have had in the Cuban society since they were mostly Spanish speaking?
Well, there were people who it had a negative and a positive influence. So there were people who were not tolerant of, this outsider culture. But there were people who were very aware of the advantages of speaking English, the English of the main employer, and so on. And so people would, get close to some of them for the linguistic exchange. So the Jamaicans would learn English and they would learn. The Jamaicans would learn Spanish and they would learn some English. They also liked the sort of habits that they brought. So they brought certain behaviors where they were perceived as being a little more orderly, which was ironic because when they were going, people felt that they were going to come and cause trouble because they had the Morant Bay Rebellion. They were close to the Haitians who had the Haitian Revolution. So initially, the authorities were afraid of them coming. And there's another side to that as well. But people felt that they were a little more well-behaved, a little more orderly, perhaps a little more refined in the way they adopted certain English, customs and so on. They went to church. They started their own church. Initially when they realized, because it wasn't all, roses and honeydew when they got there. They were rejected. They didn't enjoy a sort of strong social life. So they had to do different things to improve their social lives. And so they drew in some of the Spanish speaking people that way. Initially, there wasn't a lot of intermarriage, but that has become quite commonplace now. But it's their cultural, all their cultural sort of values were seen as attractive to the Cubans initially, after the initial skepticism and so on.
Yeah. Once they, I guess, come over the fear, then things start flowing. And you touched upon some of these different traditions that they liked. So what were, I guess, for the West Indian communities, how do they, in terms of play, in terms of introducing or adaptation of the Afro-Caribbean cultural traditions in Cuba? What were your influences?
Okay, so they started with church.
Mm-hmm.
The church was the first institution they introduced. The Salvation Army, which was not in Cuba, it was very strong in Jamaica, in the British, because that's a British movement initially. And they started that along with all the charitable deeds that the Salvation Army Church does. So that was attractive too. Poor Cuban, Spanish speaking Cubans and so on. The goodwill of the Salvation Army, pulled them into, communion, the community of the West Indians. Then they introduced the Anglican Church. First Anglican Church was introduced in Barnes, because Barnes was the first place they started to go to. And then they, started moving away from Barnes and Preston. They still have a strong community. And for me, Barnes is the most Jamaican place I've seen. They're very, very Jamaican in Barnes. In Guantanamo, there's a little of, because so many of them work on the base, they tend to have a little American influence and so on. So they introduced the Anglican Church in Barnes, then one in Guantanamo, the Methodist Church. And then they started to they have their own schools. And the children, West Indian children, would go to those schools. They would hear, all the traditions. They would tell them things like a simple thing like saying grace, where they had certain traditional graces before they ate and so on. Singing songs, the lullabies and nursery songs and so on. I haven't seen an evidence of a lot of Anansi stories. Maybe those did not survive a lot. Not like in Limon, Costa Rica. In Limon, Costa Rica, you'll hear people talk about Anansi and so on. I've asked them in Cuba. I haven't heard. Maybe it's there in Barnes, but in Guantanamo, certainly I didn't hear that. But the schools and the churches, their celebration of Nine Night, for instance, that was an important cultural element that they preserved. That was new to the Hispanic society. Remember, they have a custom where they bury within 24 hours. That's their custom. They don't have this thing that like West Indians do, where we can keep the body, for as long as ever, and every night we meet and we are singing. And then the Nine Night is a big celebration with a lot of food, typical foods and so on. So that was a big thing. They still talk about the Nine Night and then the funeral, which was different from the way Cubans do a velorio in the night, and then they go within the 24 hours and bury the person very quickly. Nine Night was a very, very big thing for them. Gatherings, social gatherings in the evenings was important to them. There's something that they think is important, which may not be significant. They seem to think that the relationship between children in the home, like there is a slight difference in the way the family. I guess when families are away from home, they tend to draw closer and so on. So they saw, a kind of closer relationship among the West Indians in their families. Sometimes the mothers would do domestic work. Sometimes they would remain at home and teach their children, teach them, I interviewed one lady who said her mother would just sing all the time. And through the singing, her English was reinforced, her understanding of little Jamaican ways, qualities, traits were reinforced and so on. But the father always went out to work. And remember that also on the centrales, the factories, sugar mill areas, they had several jobs. So there were people who worked directly on the mills. There were people who worked as repair people, carpenters to be repairing, people who could do soldering with iron and so on. And they are people who were shoemakers, people who were bookkeepers. So there was a range of jobs that they did depending on the educational level that they came from Jamaica with.
Yes, definitely a whole different range. And would you be able to speak to, I guess, with the West Indian workers, how are they treated compared to other immigrant groups in Cuba?
So when the West Indians started to go to Cuba, the first set of West Indians who went to Cuba went on what was a special law that they developed at the time to facilitate the migration of blacks into Cuba. Because Cuba was one of those countries, Cuba, along with Argentina, Brazil, there are quite a few of them that had laws which prevented what they saw as the blackening of their societies. They wanted to keep their societies white.
Mm-hmm.
And that went back way back into the works of somebody like Fernando Ortiz, and other people in Cuba who had written that the blacks are inherently evil and violent and will come and destroy the fabric of society. If you bring them, keep them away. Remember what the Haitians did in Haiti. Remember what the Jamaicans did during the Morant Bay Rebellion. You have to be careful. So when the United Fruit Company expressed need for additional workers, and it was agreed that, yes, you could bring some black people and you have to be careful, they went under this law that protected them. But, people's minds have this kind of social conditioning, and they're still saying, oh, the Jamaicans. They thought the Jamaicans would bring diseases. All the West Indians, they thought, oh, they're going to come into our country and bring diseases. They're going to create social problems. They're going to encourage people to riot when the salaries are too low. And it's not going to be good for us. So they were met with hostilities. They were met with racism and discrimination. There were some groups from Puerto Rico. So they preferred to bring in Latino people from Puerto Rico, and they preferred those. And those people felt superior to the black Jamaicans, along with the Latino Cubans who felt they were superior to the blacks. They all sort of rejected them, which is why the Jamaicans drew together. They kept, pulling together and set up. One of the things they did to socialize among themselves was to establish lodges, Masonic lodges. So they had their lodges, they went to their lodges, they went to their burial scheme. Burial scheme was a big movement among them. And as I said before, the churches and so on. But there was a lot of hostilities directed at them in the initial stages, because people had all these preconceived ideas of how these black people. Oh, and one big thing was that they feared the Jamaicans, especially because the Jamaicans were felt to be bringing this thing called obeah, right? So they had seen and heard of the Haitians. Remember, the Haitians had gone right after the Haitian Revolution, when some slave masters ran away from Santo Domingo, from San Domingue. They ran away with their slaves to Haiti. And some of the slaves were said to be practicing voodoo. They saw them as using voodoo during that revolution to defeat the white French people. And they knew that Jamaicans believed in this folk religion, Afro-folk system called Obeah. So they were very afraid, and they accused, without evidence, they were accusing Jamaicans. Now, in my research, there are Cubans who were children during the early days who are in their 80s and 90s now. And they said that it was just a handful, which is just like how it is in Jamaica. If there is such a thing as Obeah, it's just a few people who claim to be practicing this Obeah, right? So there were lots of, sort of blatant lies being told about them and so on in the way people rejected them. And the Jamaicans, the others, the Puerto Ricans, the Cubans, felt that because many of the Jamaicans came with all this experience, that they were earning more money than they. And even if they were not earning more money, but just the fact that they were coming meant that there would be fewer jobs for them. So they resented them on several different counts. Yes.
No, definitely. And the fact that you mentioned about the laws, because laws are very important for this particular region as to how it determined where people can go, how they were defined, and what they could be able to do. So I'm glad that you brought that up in terms of making sure
Yes.
was mentioned, because it's extremely important for a lot of migration in terms of being able to be able to have freedom of movement.
Oh, yes. Yes.
So with the descendants of the West Indian migrants in Cuba, how did they, perceive and of course preserve their heritage today? I know you mentioned about, their mothers singing, but was there anything else that they would have done or to be able to ensure that they kept their own identity?
Yes. So very important thing happened. So all the other sort of routine everyday things happened. They cooked their typical, West Indian foods, Caribbean foods, of course, always Jamaican foods in the main. And people still enjoy their rundown, that's coconut milk with codfish. They enjoy their ackee and saltfish, because one of the things that happened was that each time new groups would be going, I don't know what quarantine laws were like in those days, they took seedlings, and people who came back, because some would visit, they took trees. So they took breadfruit, they took akis, lime, a lot of. And when you go to Barnes looks like any Jamaican country place, where you see all these Jamaican trees. When I went to Barnes, they roasted breadfruit and gave to me. And, it was just like going to the country in Jamaica. Ackee and saltfish, it's, the Jamaican communities in Cuba and Limon, and places in Nicaragua where Jamaicans live, and Colombia are probably the only places where people eat ackee, because they don't even eat it in Africa, where it comes from. Yes. So their foods, they would have, sessions, social sessions where they would invite people. And certainly when they had their 9 nights, they would offer people the foods and so on. So that is still very strong where they have kept their cultural heritage. But Marcus Garvey went to Cuba in the 1920s, and Marcus Garvey spoke to them, had several meetings, moving through Barnes and Chaperon and different places, Preston, Holguin, all these places, and talked to them about reminding them of who they were as Black people, reminding them of their African heritage, of the need to be proud of themselves. 40 UNIA branches were established throughout Cuba. And that was very important. They're small all over in the 1920s, 30s. There are fewer of them now. I saw the one in Barnes, for instance. And of course, people would flock to them to go listen to Marcus Garvey, and they listened to the teachings of Marcus Garvey when, after he would have left and so on, and there were members there. They would march, they would have their meetings. And today they still have some of those UNIA centers. They have their lodges. As I said, the lodge is a typically British centered kind of custom. And they had their lodges. They would meet in their lodges, and that's a cultural practice that they still maintain. They had their schools where they had some Jamaican teachers were recruited to go there and teach, or went. They would have been teachers, a few of them, not many, because we were still in early post-emancipation period. So there were very few of them but there were people who were like pastors and seamstresses and so on. And they taught, and just listen, just by virtue of speaking a particular language is the biggest index of culture. And through your language, that is one important way of maintaining your heritage, because it's different. It's not Spanish, it's distinct. And they had the oral, the ways of telling stories, even if for some reason they haven't maintained a lot of those stories. But the proverbs, I think what has been preserved more than anything are the proverbs, because Jamaican old people, I don't know if you had any old Jamaican old people in here, but they're always talking in proverbs, right? Mm. My grandmother had a string of proverbs for everything, right? And they remember that all those proverbs that were, repeated to them all the time. You sleep with dog, you catch him flee, right? Chicken the merry hawk the near. If fish come from down a river bottom and tell you say alligator down there, believe him, be careful, so on, so on, so. So the proverbs are very important. And as I said before, the church was such an important way of them banding together. It's the banding together. If they were dispersed, then they wouldn't have an opportunity to preserve their culture together. And one big thing that helped them was cricket. They took cricket. They took cricket to Cuba. So in Guantanamo and Banis, and they had clubs. So the whites had their clubs, and after a time they set up their clubs, their cricket clubs. So the Americans and the whites were playing baseball, and they played their cricket. So to this day, they have their cricket clubs, and they're trying to there's a new thrust to teach cricket in Guantanamo and in these West Indian communities. But cricket was a big way of getting them to preserve. It was so different in the society at the time. Yeah.
Yeah, no, like all of what you're mentioning, all of these different elements, it kind of made sure to tie down the community and make it look like they fostered and they really grew and people were really connected. So that's fabulous to know. And then, of course, we'll go to the government now in terms of the Cuban government and, of course, their society. How did they treat the West Indian migrants during and after these migration waves that you described?
I think that they were very careful with them, because when the British government set up an office in Cuba, they had little offices and a main office called the British, what's it called? It was called the British Council or something like that. The British Overseas Office. And the West Indians took advantage of that. So every time something was done to them, they ran to them. They said they saw the Jamaicans as being chatterboxes and reporters as spies because they were continually going to the British Overseas Office to report them, and then they would take up their cause. There were times when the Jamaicans were said to have been at the forefront of challenges to the government, to the labor laws, to payment laws, and they would encourage, even the Cuban workers were encouraged by the Jamaicans to demand higher wages and so on, because they didn't have people looking out for them necessarily. But the Jamaicans knew that they could always go to their British inspectors and people who were looking out for them. That was an important, because we were still colonies.
Yes.
We still were British subjects
Mm-hmm.
until 1962 in in the case of Jamaica, 1961 for Trinidad, and I don't remember the other countries. But because we were still British subjects, the British government was still protecting its subjects on foreign soil. So there were laws. They were watching them to make sure that they didn't lead riots,
Yeah.
because that was always their fear, that Jamaicans especially would come and lead riots.
Yeah.
But they had protection from the British government. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's just like a security blanket that they use
Yes.
to be able to report any wrongdoing. So on that same vein, with the political shifts in Cuba during that time, like the revolution, did this impact or affect the West Indian communities and, of course, their cultural preservation?
Right. So the revolution happened in 1959. By then, there were more than 140,000 people of West Indian descent in Cuba, in many areas. Some had left areas like Banes, Ermita, and so on to go and work at the base, because the demand on the base for people was increasing. And that's how one of the ways in which the city of Guantanamo grew. And places like Boque Run around the base also grew with West Indians. When the revolution happened, many Jamaicans, many West Indians came because they were afraid. This was new. They didn't know how it would affect them. They had an idea that it was a completely new system of government and that perhaps they would have less freedom to speak and move about as much as they would want. So many of them returned to their countries at that time. Many of them went home to Barbados and St. Kitts and Trinidad after the revolution. And many of them were encouraged by people who had worked on the base for a long time and had been sort of fed the idea that the revolution means communism. It's a terrible thing. You're going to suffer. You're going to be controlled. It's going to be oppressive, because they were at the base where they were hearing a lot of American dogma. So many of them left at that time. Before the revolution itself, there were some Jamaicans who actually supported the revolution. They were said in a place it's now called Costa Rica in Cuba. It was known as Ermita. After the revolution, the Castro government changed it to Costa Rica. It was one of the places where revolutionaries hid. There are many revolutionaries throughout, because this was thick countryside with lots of sugarcane where they could hide. And it is said that some of the Jamaican people in the Jamaican communities supported them by hiding them, keeping them in their houses, and so on. In some cases, some of them say it hasn't affected them, but in other cases, and those are few, those people who say it didn't affect them. And I think that's mainly because they don't want to be seen as being critical of the revolution. But it changed their lifestyle. There was a sort of greater control of the churches, right? So the churches are still there. They still go to church. It's not, some people think that, people in Cuba could not go to church at all. They went to church, but the churches were watched. There's a lot of vigilance of everything in Cuba. They watch because the society was, rigorously reorganized. So you had the community being divided up. This area would have, somebody that you have to report to. You can't just pick up yourself and go to Havana without going to whatever the office is called to get permission and so on. Your movement is restricted, right? The whole idea of rationing and so on, food being distributed, everything is more controlled, more organized. So there were people who felt that their freedom was restricted a lot more. But there are many people who went back home, especially those who were on the American base, because they were warned and told, it's going to be bad and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I guess under this backdrop of, with the revolution, how would have, I guess, the oral traditions and, of course, storytelling, help to preserve the West Indian heritage in Cuba? I know you mentioned about some aspects of that earlier, but would you able to just dive a little bit deeper into this question?
If that affected the preservation of culture, it would be perhaps because people felt restrained, constrained under the new regime. So probably at some point there was less socializing, became less. But there, in the revolution, things like Santeria continues to be practiced.
Mm-hmm.
Even though the colonial government in Cuba tried to eradicate Santeria, right? But there are still huge Santeria groups in Cuba. So there's some cultural practice that no government can get rid of, right? They may be able to get people to talk less, to gather less, and so on. But people still find ways of part of their folklore is their story, their history, who they are, their people, what their people came to Cuba with. Or people were proud, or people were clean, or people had good hygiene. They practiced certain customs, which Cubans, one of the things they talk about is the way the women dressed. That the women dressed very well. Their hair was always beautifully coiffed at all times. And I have a friend who says, oh, they used to try to copy the hairstyle, different kind of hair, but they try to copy the hairstyle of the women, because the women were the women were, interested in their physical appearances. And when you see the pictures, you see that they dressed very well. Caribbean people have always been killer dressers. So there was that, the dressing, the weddings, the British West Indies Centre. The British West Indies Centre was very important. It's a centre that was built. It was built in 1945. It was built in 1945, and it's called the British West Indies Centre. Old building still there. It became like a social center for the West Indies. That played a huge role in helping them to maintain their cultural heritage and identity. So they would meet The women would teach the young women things like crocheting, which they took to Cuba because that's something they did in the British West Indies. Crocheting, embroidering, the cooking of certain foods. So this is where it was like, I don't know if you know about 4-H clubs,
Yes.
but it was a club for the adults, right? Or Women's Federation. When I was growing up, they had a thing called Women's, and the women would go and they would learn these things in the evening, learn to cook certain foods to set the table, you know, learn to keep the house, to do proper housekeeping and so on. So they did that at the British. They learned to play dominoes. They would go and play dominoes and drafts and all these English games and so on. They still have it. They still have members who have been there committed from the beginning, have some very old people still committed to preserving that culture. Initially, the part of the role of the British West Indies Centre was to welcome people who got there. So when some of them got there in the night and so on, they didn't know where they were going.
Yeah.
So when they got there, it's in Guantanamo, and they would go there, somebody would be there to receive them and help, explain things to them, tell them where they can go to get jobs and so on. They could stay there. They have a little section in the back where people could stay, for a little, or they would put them in touch with somebody who could keep them for a little while until they found jobs and so on. Sometimes they were recruited before, so they went knowing that I'm going to X place, so they would help them to get there. So that little place, there's a whole group of them now, a committee that's so devoted to the preservation of that place because it has done so much for them. They had English classes. They had English classes there because they saw that English was so critical to the maintaining of their culture. And the cooking classes, they taught them to cook their ackee and saltfish, bake toto, cook greater cake, make greater cake, make drops, make gizadas, make bun. These, some of the things that I take for granted but bun is such a big thing. They talk about bun all the time and how their mothers used to give them bun for breakfast, and their mothers baked bread and so on and fed them. So they were not wealthy, but they were never hungry because the women knew how to cook and how to turn their hands and make fashion and make something out of a little bit and so on. But it's a very rich history and cultural story that they have preserved there.
Yeah, which is fabulous. And as you said, with the community of so close knit and all of these different factors to ensure that it was entirely ingrained and to be able to support them while they, while they lived there. And so, Professor Ramsey, as we close, what lessons can be drawn from the West Indian experience in Cuba, especially regarding migration and labor and, of course, cultural resistance?
Right. I think that there's obviously a lesson about resilience, about strength, about determination. There's a story about caring for family. Because one thing I didn't mention is that when they went in the early days, they were sending back money to their families. So many of them would leave because this was an opportunity for them to earn a little more money than they would make had they remained in Jamaica. And there were remittances. They were sending back money to look after their families. And many of them, once they felt sufficiently settled and established, they would come back for their families, their wives and children, those who had left them. Some of them got married and started their own families. Many of them got married, started families there. And they were committed to taking care of them. whether they had to relocate. If they started out in Barnes, they would relocate if it was necessary to Guantanamo or to Santiago or Holguin, somewhere else to look after their families. So I think it is the story of strength, of the strength of a people, pride in who they are, and in being willing to continue to say, I'm Jamaican, I'm living in Cuba now, but I'm Jamaican, I'm Kititian, I'm Vincentian, because this is how they see themselves. But there is a little concern that their fourth generation people are not necessarily so committed to that way. And one way you can tell is that they're not interested in preserving the language. So most of them are. And once I did a lecture there and I had to speak to them, young people in their, 18, 19, I said, this is what you have. This is what makes you special and different from other Cubans. You don't want to be just an average Cuban who can only speak Spanish. You have English. Your grandmother is sitting at home speaking English. Your grandfather is sitting there speaking English. Learn it. That is what will take you outside of Cuba, so that is the concern. And generally speaking, things are very rough in Cuba now. The socioeconomic situation is very bad for everybody. So that's where they are, because the embargo has really, and COVID really was hard for them. Many of them died. Many of the elderly died. Yes.
Oh, wow. This is, Professor Ramsey, again, I just want to really thank you for coming on and discussing this and to just, really give the narrative on especially this type of migration from, other West Indian countries to Cuba and the resilience of them being able to keep their own identity to a certain point for a number of generations, but as well that this has been done. And of course, I know that we didn't go into some of the other aspects, which is fine. But the fact that you mentioned about the United Food Company, which is massive in terms of their facilitating of migration in and of itself. They didn't just move produce, they moved people. And you can always find those records. But no, thank you so much for your time. I really do appreciate it.
And thank you so much for inviting me and giving me a chance to share some of my research and my ideas on this very important subject. Thank you so very much.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode. And if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you.